Every major shift in how humanity processes information has left a fingerprint somewhere in the data, long before anyone understood what that fingerprint actually meant. The printing press left one in literacy records. Television left one in Nielsen ratings decades before anyone called it a cultural shift. And in the summer of 2026, YouTube's own recommendation infrastructure quietly left a fingerprint that content strategists, media researchers, and platform economists are still arguing about. A fingerprint that has nothing to do with subscriber counts or production budgets, and everything to do with a simple, uncomfortable ratio: fewer videos, producing more views per video than almost any other category on the platform. That ratio matters because it breaks a rule that has held steady since YouTube's earliest days. On a platform with infinite content and finite attention, supply and demand are supposed to correct themselves quickly. When a topic gets popular, creators flood in, competition rises, and the per-video advantage shrinks back toward average within months. That's not what happened here. A small, almost stubbornly limited number of videos about a single topic kept generating outsized returns, and the gap didn't shrink. It widened. To understand why that widening gap should genuinely interest you, and why it's being treated inside parts of the media analytics industry as a leading indicator rather than a curiosity, you need to go back to a period most casual viewers never noticed happening at all. The years when this exact topic sat almost entirely outside the algorithm's favor, treated as a dead category not worth the production investment. Because the story of how it clawed its way back isn't really about UFOs. It's about what happens when an entire information category gets starved of real material for decades, and then, suddenly, isn't anymore. Before you can understand the anomaly, you need to understand the drought that preceded it. For most of the 2010s, UFO and UAP content occupied a strange, marginalized position on YouTube, popular enough to sustain a handful of dedicated channels, but structurally treated by the platform's advertiser-friendly guidelines as adjacent to conspiracy content, which meant reduced monetization eligibility and, in many cases, reduced algorithmic promotion compared to equivalent science content. Creators covering this space were working against the platform's own incentive structure, not with it. That started shifting slowly with a series of institutional developments most casual audiences barely registered as connected. In 2017, the New York Times published its account of a Pentagon program investigating unexplained aerial encounters, based on interviews with former defense officials. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence delivered its first unclassified assessment of UAP incidents to Congress. In 2022, the Department of Defense formally stood up the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, specifically to centralize UAP investigation across military branches. Each of these was treated by the platform, and by advertisers, as a legitimate news event rather than fringe content, a subtle but real reclassification that gradually opened monetization and promotion doors that had been closed for most of the previous decade. None of that, on its own, explains the specific data anomaly this video is built around. What it does explain is the runway, the reason this category was positioned, structurally, to absorb a sudden supply shock when one actually arrived. And in February 2026, that supply shock arrived in a form nobody in the content industry had modeled for: a sitting government administration, issuing a direct order to release UAP-related records on a public scheduled timeline, through a dedicated new portal built specifically for that purpose. That single decision is where this story's real anomaly begins. Here's the explanation almost every media outlet reached for first when this data pattern became visible. Supply shock, plain and simple. New government portal, new declassified files, temporary content gold rush. Every creator covering the space would eventually flood in, competition would rise, and the per-video engagement advantage would normalize within a few months, the same way it always does when a niche topic suddenly gets fresh material. On paper, that's a completely reasonable prediction, grounded in how content ecosystems have behaved for the platform's entire history. Except the flood never fully arrived, and that's the detail that started raising real questions among people tracking the category closely. Standard supply shock dynamics predict a rapid multiplication of competing creators within weeks of a viral news event. You saw exactly that pattern during the 2023 congressional UAP hearings, when dozens of new channels launched within a single month to cover the story, only to see per-video engagement collapse back toward baseline almost as quickly as it spiked. This time, that multiplication didn't happen at anywhere near the same rate. The number of channels actively producing document-grounded, primary source UAP content stayed comparatively small relative to the audience demand tracking behind it. The second crack in the simple explanation came from duration. A pure supply shock produces a spike that decays as supply catches up to demand, a bell curve, not a plateau. But independent trend tracking data covering the months following each 2026 Pursue portal release showed something closer to a sustained elevated baseline than a decaying spike, holding steady even in the weeks between individual document drops rather than collapsing back down. Supply shocks don't usually behave like that. Something structural was keeping the supply artificially constrained even as demand kept climbing, and it took someone examining the creator side of the equation, rather than the audience side, to figure out why. Every version of this story needs someone who saw the actual mechanism early, and in this case, that person was a mid-tier science and technology creator who had been covering UAP disclosure material consistently since the AARO office was first established in 2022, years before it became a lucrative topic, when doing so still carried real monetization risk under the platform's older content guidelines. In interviews given to industry trade publications in mid-2026, this creator described noticing something the bigger networks and analysts hadn't yet flagged. The barrier to entry for credible content in this specific category wasn't audience interest, and it wasn't platform policy anymore. It was verification labor. Their argument, laid out in detail, was straightforward but easy to overlook if you weren't actually producing the content yourself. Each Pursue portal release didn't arrive as a polished, easily summarized press statement. It arrived as raw case files, cross-reference radar logs, FBI interview transcripts, and internal government memos using specialized terminology, often running dozens of pages per case. Producing an accurate video required actually reading and cross-checking that primary material, not simply reacting to a headline, and that verification step took days of research most general interest creators weren't willing or equipped to invest, especially when a finished AI explainer video could be produced from a single product announcement in a fraction of the time. That observation, when it first circulated, didn't get much traction outside a narrow circle of creators already working in the space. It contradicted the assumption most of the industry still held, that viral government disclosure material was inherently easy content, essentially free B-roll waiting to be repackaged by anyone with editing software. The frustrating part of this story is that the actual mechanism, a structural verification bottleneck limiting supply even as demand kept rising, sat publicly discussed in industry interviews for weeks before analysts with broader platform access started treating it as the explanation, rather than a side comment from someone with an obvious stake in the category staying uncrowded. So let's actually walk through what the verification bottleneck looked like in practice, because the specifics matter more than the summary. Take the June 12, 2026 Pursue release specifically, the one containing the Cheyenne Mountain Mother Orb case file. That single release included an AARO summary memo running to dozens of pages, FBI-produced digital renderings of witness descriptions, cross-referenced ADS-B transponder data used to rule out aircraft explanations, and video interview footage from at least 6 separate federal agents, each requiring independent review before a creator could accurately summarize what the case file actually claimed versus what a rushed headline implied it claimed. Compare that to the average AI-focused video published in the same window, which typically required summarizing a single company press release or product demo, most of which arrived prepackaged with talking points, marketing copy, and ready-made B-roll footage specifically designed for easy media reuse. The production math wasn't close. A creator could turn around 3 or 4 AI explainer videos in the time it took to properly verify a single UAP case file against its primary government source, which meant the category's content supply stayed structurally throttled by labor cost, even as raw audience search volume climbed sharply in the same period. Independent trend tracking data from mid-2026 makes this mechanical asymmetry visible in the raw numbers. Roughly 7 primary source UAP videos across the tracked sample generated a combined 3.57 million views with an engagement rate outperforming the top AI-focused content in the same category window. Not because those 7 videos had extraordinary production budgets or channel size, but because they were, functionally, some of the only fully verified options available for an audience actively searching the topic, in a period when search interest was measurably spiking across news, entertainment, and government portal traffic simultaneously. Once that mechanical explanation started circulating more widely, several people inside the platform economics space tried to test it against alternative theories, because a single creator's account, however detailed, isn't proof on its own. Independent trend tracking analysts compared per-video engagement rates against publicly available channel count data across several previous UAP news cycles including 2017's Pentagon program story and 2021's congressional report, specifically to check whether previous disclosure moments had shown the same verification bottleneck pattern or whether 2026 was structurally different. What that comparison found complicated the simple story further. Both 2017 and 2021 did produce short-term engagement spikes, but neither sustained an elevated per-video advantage for more than a few weeks, largely because those disclosure moments were single events rather than a repeating, scheduled release cadence. The verification bottleneck theory alone doesn't fully explain why 2026 sustained its advantage longer. A bottleneck limits supply regardless of whether the news cycle is a single event or a repeating one. Something about the repeating, predictable nature of the per-se release schedule appeared to be compounding the bottleneck's effect, rather than simply coexisting alongside it, though the exact mechanism connecting those two variables remained, as of mid-2026, only partially modeled. A second complicating factor came from advertiser data. Multiple industry sources reported that brand safety classifications for UAP content had genuinely shifted following the government's own direct involvement in the 2026 disclosures. Content citing an official Pentagon memo carried meaningfully lower demonetization risk than content built on unverified witness speculation, which had been the dominant format throughout the 2010s. That shift, layered on top of the verification bottleneck, meant the small number of creators capable of doing rigorous primary source work were also facing less competition from previously excluded but faster to produce speculative content, since platform guidelines were now actively rewarding the harder, slower approach for the first time in the category's history. Even with those two mechanisms working together, genuine gaps remain unresolved, and it's worth being honest about exactly where this analysis runs out of hard data. Nobody currently has a reliable model predicting how long a scheduled government disclosure cadence can sustain an elevated engagement baseline before either audience fatigue sets in or enough creators develop the verification workflow needed to close the supply gap. Early indicators through mid-2026 suggested the advantage was holding, but the entire dataset covers only a few months, nowhere near enough time to distinguish a durable structural pattern from an unusually long-lived but ultimately temporary anomaly. There's also an unresolved question about whether the verification bottleneck is actually the primary driver, or simply the most visible and easiest to articulate factor among several overlapping causes. Cross-category spillover into space exploration, military history, and true crime audiences, tracked separately by trend analysts, doesn't cleanly fit inside a pure verification labor explanation, since spillover into unrelated categories should theoretically be unaffected by how hard any single creator's production workflow is. Something about the underlying content itself, not just the difficulty of producing it, appears to be driving audience behavior in ways the labor bottleneck theory doesn't fully capture on its own. And there's a third question nobody in this space has answered convincingly yet. Does the recommendation algorithm itself weight verified, primary source-cited content differently than unverified speculation, independent of watch time and click-through metrics, in a way that would make this advantage partially self-reinforcing rather than purely audience-driven? YouTube doesn't publish its internal ranking weightings, which means this specific question, arguably the most important one for understanding whether this pattern is repeatable in other content categories, currently has no confirmed answer at all, only competing theories from analysts working entirely from the outside. Here's the moment that actually reframed this from an interesting anomaly into something closer to an industry case study, and it's worth walking through as the discovery sequence it genuinely was. In late July 2026, a coalition of independent media researchers, working from publicly available YouTube Trends data rather than any single creator's internal analytics, ran a direct historical comparison. Had any topic, in the platform's entire recorded category history, ever achieved a top engagement ranking inside science and technology while simultaneously maintaining one of the smallest active creator counts in that same category? The answer that comparison returned was no. Not during the smartphone launch cycles that used to dominate consumer tech content. Not during any previous space exploration milestone, including crewed launch events that historically generated far larger raw view totals but never achieved this particular combination of high engagement per video alongside low content supply. The UAP disclosure wave of 2026 was, by this specific metric, the first documented instance of that exact combination occurring inside the platform's modern categorization system. That reframe, from a popular topic with a small number of good videos, to the first documented case of a demand-supply imbalance this severe, sustained this long, inside a major content category, is what moved this data point out of niche creator forums and into broader media economics conversations. It stopped being a story about UFOs specifically and started being treated as a potential preview of what happens whenever a serious verification barrier collides with a genuinely credible, scheduled information source in any content category, not just this one. If this story has one element worth treating as its own character, it isn't a spacecraft or a document. It's the recommendation algorithm itself, and the specific way its engagement weighting mechanics interact with content scarcity. YouTube's recommendation system, as publicly described in the platform's own creator documentation, prioritizes signals like watch time duration, click-through rate, and audience retention relative to a video's available competition within its category, meaning a genuinely good video facing less competition for the same search terms will structurally outperform an equally good video competing against thousands of similar uploads, independent of raw production quality. That mechanic is normally invisible because content scarcity this severe almost never happens by accident in a category with genuine audience demand. Creators fill gaps quickly precisely because the algorithm rewards them for doing so. What makes 2026 UAP content wave unusual is that the gap didn't close at the expected rate, because the barrier to entry wasn't audience interest, platform policy, or monetization risk, the three factors that normally regulate content supply. It was, specifically, verification labor cost, a barrier the algorithm has no mechanism to detect or account for, because it operates entirely on the creator side of the production pipeline, invisible to any audience-facing metric the system tracks. That's the part of this story that should genuinely interest you even if you have zero interest in UFOs, specifically. The algorithm, in this specific case, ended up functioning less like an engine actively promoting a topic, and more like a magnifying glass, revealing a supply gap that already existed for entirely separate structural reasons, and had simply never been visible at this scale before, because no comparable category had ever combined credible, scheduled source material with a labor-intensive verification requirement quite like this one. So here's where the confirmed facts actually leave you. It's documented, through independent trend tracking data and platform analytics, that a small number of UAP-focused videos sustained a per-video engagement advantage over a period of several months in 2026, outperforming categories with dramatically larger active creator populations. It's also documented, through direct creator interviews and comparative production time analysis, that the primary constraint limiting content supply in this category was verification labor rather than audience interest, platform restriction, or monetization risk. What remains genuinely unresolved is durability. Nobody currently has enough longitudinal data to say with confidence whether this represents a permanent recalibration of how verified, primary source content performs relative to faster, less rigorous content across the platform broadly, or a temporary condition specific to this particular disclosure schedule that will normalize once either the government's release cadence slows or enough creators build the verification workflows needed to close the gap. Analysts tracking this pattern are watching closely whether similar dynamics emerge in other categories with credible scheduled government or institutional data releases, since if the pattern generalizes, it would represent something considerably larger than a UFO content trend. What has already changed, regardless of how that broader question resolves, is the demonstrated existence of the mechanism itself. Before 2026, there was no clearly documented, widely discussed case of a content category maintaining severe supply scarcity this long despite obvious, verifiable audience demand. That specific structural pattern now has a real tracked example behind it, and whatever happens to UAP content specifically going forward, the underlying mechanism it revealed isn't going away just because the news cycle eventually moves on. There's something worth sitting with in the idea that the biggest content anomaly of 2026 wasn't produced by a more sophisticated algorithm, a bigger marketing budget, or a more talented set of creators. It was produced, almost accidentally, by the simple friction of doing verification work properly, in a moment when a genuinely credible source of information happened to require exactly that kind of care to use responsibly. That's a strange, almost old-fashioned explanation for a very modern-looking data anomaly, and it doesn't fit neatly into either the algorithm as all-powerful narrative or the audience's just want spectacle narrative that usually gets applied to platforms like this one. Maybe the more honest lesson sitting underneath all of this data isn't really about UFOs, or even about YouTube specifically. It's a reminder that scarcity, real, structural scarcity, can still exist even inside a system built on infinite content and instant publishing, whenever the actual bottleneck is something the system itself has no way of measuring. Whether or not this particular pattern holds a year from now, it already proved for a little while in 2026 that doing the harder, slower thing correctly could still outperform doing the easier thing quickly, and on a platform this large, that's a stranger and more interesting discovery than almost anything sitting inside the case files themselves.